The silence cracked with a single thought. No one ever sees the shadow until it swallows them whole. That is how everything began. Elias knew his place in the world. At least, that's what everyone around him insisted he should know. He was the man people passed by without a second glance. The one they asked to carry their burdens, but never their secrets. The one who existed only to make others more comfortable, invisible, unless there was a task too dirty for their own hands. He swept the marble floors of the courthouse at dawn, polishing the stone that echoed with the voices of men in power. He scrubbed the walls that hid the whispers of corruption. He emptied the bins filled with the drafts of speeches that preached about justice but reeked of compromise. And still, no one knew his name. He wasn't just a cleaner. He wasn't just the man with bent shoulders and tired eyes. He was the consequence of a past no one cared to ask about. And that past had shackled him to this place, to servitude, to invisibility. But Elias had something no one could see, a talent carved into him through years of silence and suffering, a gift forged from the scars of injustice, something they would only discover when it was far too late. The courthouse belonged to Judge Harrington. At least, that's what people said in hushed tones. His word was law inside those walls. His judgments carried the weight of thunder, his arrogance the calm certainty of a man who had never been told no. He despised weakness. He despised poverty. Most of all, he despised people like Elias, the ones who bowed their heads and moved quickly out of sight. To Harrington, they weren't people at all. They were tools, dust meant to be brushed away. Careful with that vase, Harrington had once barked, his voice slicing the air as Elias polished the judge's office. It's worth more than your life. Elias hadn't answered. He never did. Silence was his shield. But inside, those words had cut deep. The truth was cruel. The vase was worth more than his life, at least in the judge's eyes, and in the eyes of a society that had already sentenced Elias long before he ever walked into that courthouse with a mop in his hand. The catalyst arrived on a night like any other, but nothing ordinary survives the weight of fate. It began with a scream, not the scream of someone in pain, not the scream of someone afraid. It was the scream of a man whose certainty had just been torn apart. Judge Harrington stumbled from his chambers, his face pale, his hands trembling. His bodyguards rushed to him, but their strength was useless. Papers were scattered across the floor, flames licking at the edges of confidential files. The fire alarm shrieked into the night, sprinklers raining chaos, yet none of it mattered compared to what Harrington gasped. "They've come for me," he said. "They've finally come." He collapsed into a chair, clutching his chest. But it wasn't a heart attack. It was fear, pure, suffocating fear. The scandal had erupted. Secrets too heavy to stay buried had clawed their way out. A network of corruption tied to Harrington's rulings, his wealth, his power now bleeding into the light. The evidence was scattered everywhere, but no one could make sense of it. The fire had destroyed half. The files that survived were encrypted, impossible to decipher. His staff panicked, useless in their frantic attempts. And then Elias appeared. Soaked from the sprinklers, mop in hand, he stood quietly in the chaos, unnoticed, forgotten, just as always. Until he spoke. I can read it. The words sliced through the noise. Everyone turned. For the first time, eyes landed on him. Suspicion, confusion, contempt. Judge Harrington narrowed his gaze. "You? Don't waste my time." But Elias didn't flinch. His voice, steady and low, carried a weight no one expected. "You want to know who's coming for you. You want to know how to survive this. I can tell you. But you'll have to listen." The room fell into silence. Only the hiss of fire sprinklers filled the air. Harrington laughed, bitter and sharp. "A janitor thinks he can do what my entire legal team cannot?" Elias looked at him then, really looked. And Harrington for the first time felt seen. Not as a judge, not as a man of power, but as a frightened soul stripped bare. "I don't think," Elias said softly. "I know." What none of them understood was that Elias had once lived in a world of codes and secrets. Long before he was forced into silence, he had been a mind others envied, a man who saw patterns where others saw chaos. But envy can turn to betrayal. And betrayal had buried him under a false conviction, erasing his name, branding him unworthy. Now that buried man was clawing his way back. Harrington, desperate, hesitated. He looked at his advisors, but their eyes betrayed panic. He turned back to Elias. "Prove it," the judge hissed. And Elias did. He sat down at the smoldering desk, the charred fragments of files in front of him. His fingers traced the ash-stained edges. He began to murmur, piecing fragments together, reading not just the words, but the patterns behind them. Hidden connections. Invisible truths. Secrets encrypted not just in code, but in intent. The room leaned closer. The air tightened. And as Elias spoke, every word was a revelation. He revealed who had leaked the documents. He uncovered the path the evidence would take. He described how Harrington's enemies had set the trap, and how it would close within days if no action was taken. The powerful judge, the untouchable man, sat frozen, listening, dependent on the invisible janitor who had never been worth more than a passing insult. The shift had begun, but the revelation was only the beginning, because Harrington didn't yet know the full story. He didn't yet understand who Elias truly was, or why the shadows clung to him with such hunger. And Elias wasn't sure if he would reveal the truth, or let Harrington drown in the same darkness that had once destroyed him. The night thickened. Harrington leaned closer, his voice raw with disbelief. "Who are you?" And Elias smiled a smile carved from years of silence. "The man you threw away." The room froze, and the past began to bleed into the present. The weight of those words sank into the room like lead. "The man you threw away." Judge Harrington's lips trembled, but no sound came out. For the first time, the powerful man had no weapon, no threat, no command, only silence. Elias sat still, his hands resting calmly on the table, as if time itself waited for him to continue. But inside, he wasn't calm. He felt the old wound reopening, raw and fresh. Memories clawed their way back, dragging him into the years he had buried beneath layers of humiliation and anonymity. He remembered the trial, the courtroom filled with whispers, the cold eyes of Harrington staring down at him, the false evidence, the twisted words, the gavel that condemned him not to prison, but to invisibility, a sentence worse than chains. Harrington had been younger then, ruthless, ambitious, hungry for recognition. And Elias had been in the wrong place, at the wrong time, carrying a truth that no one wanted to hear, a truth that threatened the wrong people. "I warned them," Elias murmured, his voice more to himself than anyone else. "I told the truth. And you called me a liar. You stripped me of everything. My name, my family, my future. Do you remember?" Harrington's face paled further. His advisors shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting toward the exits. But no one dared interrupt. "Yes," Harrington whispered finally, his voice dry as dust. Elias leaned forward, his words slow, deliberate. "You destroyed me. To climb higher, to look stronger, to silence the man who saw what you refused to see." The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Harrington clenched his fists, but he didn't deny it. Couldn't deny it, because he remembered. The revelation cut deeper than Elias expected, and with it came something unexpected shame flickering across Harrington's face. The shame of a man who finally saw the blood on his own hands. But Elias wasn't finished. "You ask me who I am," he said, his voice steady. I am the ghost of your judgment, the shadow of your choice, and now you beg me for salvation." The irony was heavy, almost unbearable. Elias felt it in his chest, like a storm waiting to break. And still, Harrington lowered his head. The mighty judge bent before the janitor. "Then save me," Harrington whispered, "if you still can." The transformation began that night, not with triumph, but with vulnerability. Harrington wasn't the man of iron he pretended to be. He was human, flawed, afraid, and Elias. He wasn't just the forgotten shadow anymore. He had become something else. A mirror, a reminder, a force the judge could not ignore. Elias guided him step by step through the labyrinth of destruction. He revealed which enemies had orchestrated the scandal, which allies had betrayed him, and which moves would still keep him alive. But he didn't do it for Harrington. He did it for himself, for justice, for the truth that had been stolen from him. And as Harrington listened, his arrogance cracked. For the first time, he saw Elias, not as a servant, not as dust, but as the man he had once broken and who had risen again, unshaken by the years of silence. By dawn, the courthouse smelled of smoke and betrayal. The scandal could not be undone, but it could be redirected. Harrington had a chance to survive, but only if he clung to the man he once condemned. Before they parted, Harrington stopped Elias at the door. His voice trembled, softer than anyone had ever heard. "Why help me? After everything I did to you, why not let me burn?" Elias paused. The answer was heavy on his tongue. He could have said revenge wasn't enough. He could have said he pitied him. But instead, he whispered the truth. "Because letting you burn would make me like you. And I refuse to become the thing that destroyed me." Harrington closed his eyes, and for the first time, his power meant nothing. His silence was the silence of a man confronted with himself. But the story didn't end with Harrington's shame, because whispers spread. The staff who had seen the janitor decode what no one else could. The officials who watched Harrington lean on the man he once humiliated. The courthouse itself seemed to tremble with the shift. People began to ask, "Who is Elias?" And once a question is asked, it cannot be unasked. The shadow had stepped into the light. Days later, Harrington summoned Elias again, not as a servant, not as invisible, but as an equal, though the word tasted bitter in his mouth. He confessed more that day. He spoke of his hunger for power, of the compromises that turned him into a man he no longer recognized. He admitted he had seen Elias's talent back then, but feared it would expose too much, destroy too much, and so he buried him. The words hung heavy. Elias listened, but offered no comfort, only truth. "You feared me then. You fear me now. But this time, I decide what happens with your fear." Harrington bowed his head. "And what do you decide?" Elias let the silence stretch. Then he spoke words that echoed far beyond that room. "That truth cannot be buried forever. Not mine, not yours. It always finds a way back. I am proof of that." The legacy of that night didn't belong to Harrington. It belonged to Elias. He had been invisible, forgotten, erased. But from the ashes of betrayal, he rose as the reminder the world didn't want, but desperately needed, that every shadow holds a story, that every silence hides a truth, that the ones cast aside are the ones who will one day hold the power to decide who stands and who falls. And as Elias walked away from the courthouse for the last time, he carried not vengeance, not triumph, but something greater, a truth sharp enough to cut through centuries. Those who are unseen will one day be the ones no one can ignore. The final echo lingered, dark and universal. We build empires on the backs of the forgotten. But when the forgotten rise, empires crumble. And that night, Elias had risen.